Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Code and Pixels podcast. My name is Kelly Harrop, and I am joined by my co-host, Adekunle Oduye. Hey, Adekunle, who are we talking to today?
Hey Kelly, we're joined by Aisha Mezerana, and she joined us from San Francisco. How are you doing? Or
I'm
Seattle,
doing
sorry.
well, just to throw a curveball, I'm actually in San Diego for Thanksgiving week, so you know. I am usually in Seattle though. But yeah, I'm doing well. I'm enjoying being back in San Diego. I lived here for school and I'm visiting family for the holiday and excited to talk to you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Wait, is San Diego as good as people have been saying? Because everyone I know saying that you must visit San Diego, and if you visit, you're never gonna leave. Is that true?
It's pretty close to true. I would say it depends how much you like having seasons. If you don't mind not having seasons like San Francisco, then you'll love it. For us, we wanted a bit more variation, which is why we ended up in Seattle.
Cool, cool. Um, so let's get right into it. Aisha, tell us about the company you work for and your role.
Sure. I work at Pinterest and I work on the design systems team as a design technologist. I think most folks are probably familiar with Pinterest. We are always trying to bring people inspiration to find that next cool thing that they want to do or visit or see or try. But on the design systems team in particular, I work with both the designers and engineers for our design system as well as the whole company. So I know I mentioned this a couple of times over the past, it's stuff like Clarity, but design technologist role really lives in the middle of those worlds. And so I see myself as kind of the bridge between design questions and engineering questions, the folks on both teams, and really ensuring that we produce a high quality design system, one that's accessible and meets the needs of our engineers and accounts for all the interesting things that our designers are working on.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like especially our roles is like bringing the bridge, but then also people think that allows them to walk all over us. But that's not the case. We're here to connect folks, like connectors,
Exactly.
sort of. Um, Sweet. Can you tell us a little bit about like your different roles you had in the past and kind of how you got to Pinterest?
Yeah, totally. I actually started as a UX engineer back at Salesforce on a prototyping team. So it was a little bit more fine-tuned than design systems. We were specifically working with designers and researchers to create high fidelity, in-depth, data-driven prototypes that our research team would put in front of customers to test things that were highly interactive, right? So it was things that a Figma or Sketch prototype couldn't account for. And so I started off in that world. The designers on our team got really good at prototyping themselves. So we kind of disbanded the prototyping team, which was honestly a good thing to see, and we loved it. And then I ended up joining the Lightning Design System team from there. So that's kind of my first intro into design systems, was working with the amazing team on Lightning. And that's where I learned so much about component development and design tokens and accessibility and writing documentation for a design system. That's kind of where it all started. And then from there, I wanted a slightly different experience. I wanted to go from the massive Salesforce level company to a smaller startup level. So I ended up at Optimizely working on their design system and component library. Theirs was much less public and much less official and was kind of at the beginning stages of its life cycle. So it was really fun to work in a very different area and a much smaller team. I was kind of the only, I was also a UX engineer over there, but kind of the only one maintaining the code library. And so got to work closely with a very tight-knit group of designers and product managers to figure out what needed to be built and how we could improve the accessibility of the product. And then that led me to Pinterest to work on Gestalt, which is the name of our design system. And similarly here, switched into more of a design technologist role, but it's been pretty similar to that UX engineer title and really focusing on the design system, the documentation, accessible components, introducing accessibility to a lot of designers and engineers through things like tutorials and training sessions and presentations. Yeah,
Nice. It's very rare you get to talk to folks that were both like design technologists and also UX engineers. Again, some companies are like kind of the same, but there's like I feel like
yeah.
there's like a slight difference between those two roles. But it's pretty good to kind of hear how you went from when you started to where you're at right now. Um, yeah, I guess the next question is more around for like if you could kind of choose one, but what is the biggest challenge you're facing right now with design system at Pinterest?
I think for us, we're in a very interesting transition period. We very recently switched from being a single platform design system, so only supporting web, to now officially supporting iOS and Android as well. So we went through a big refactor of our site and our documentation and our Slack channels and our, onboarding sessions. All of it had to change because it was such a big shift to go from only supporting web to now supporting all three platforms. And so our challenge right now is figuring out, okay, what does that mean for next steps, right? How do we integrate that into the documentation? How do we integrate that change into our support channels and our office hours? And what does it really mean to suddenly support mobile, right? What components change? Do the names of components change depending on the platform, right? Are the properties more strict on mobile because there are certain patterns that are a bit stronger in mobile atmospheres? That's definitely the big challenge we're facing right now. It's a really fun one to be facing, but that's where we are.
Interesting. Yeah, that's pretty cool, especially going from like web to like supporting iOS and Android. I'm just curious, like, what is the makeup of the design system team? Do you all have folks
Yeah.
that are focused on like different platforms, or you're all still kind of figuring that out?
Yeah, so that's definitely work in progress as well. Design systems is so much about the people that you're supporting and the people working on it. So we have full-time designers who are working kind of in different areas. So one of them focused on web, one of them focused on our monetization product. So not the Pinterest that you and I might be familiar with, but the back end side of it that runs ads and campaigns. And then we have another designer focused really heavily on mobile. And so all of our designers work on a little bit of everything. So it's not totally siloed in the sense that if one person needs to go on vacation, like that is very doable, right? That's something we're actively trying to avoid. But people do kind of have their specialties that they're working on. And then there's myself and another design technologist kind of working in the middle and working on a little bit of everything. And then our engineers who right now are focused on web. And the hope is to one day, fingers crossed, end up with dedicated mobile engineers for the design system, either embedded within the mobile teams or maybe on the design systems team. But that's the part that's still a work in progress.
Very cool. I've primarily worked in web, so I can empathize with that. But I'm on a team now where we have iOS and Android engineers, and so
Nice.
it's been a great learning opportunity, like learning the constraints and the terminology you
Yeah.
mentioned, the different terms and what people
Yeah.
use across all platforms. And what do I call this, a border or like a stroke or
Yeah.
things like that.
Exactly.
So outline. So you mentioned earlier you talked about design system documentation, and that's actually the topic of today's episode. So I wanted to dig a little deeper and ask you maybe a little bit about what documentation looks like for design systems at Pinterest.
Yeah. So for us, we are really focused on having a single source of truth that applies to both designers and engineers and product and content as well. But one of our main goals is that we don't have fragmentation across our documentation. So we're trying to pull things out of Dropbox or Google Docs or even sometimes Figma, right? Places where these little tidbits of knowledge and design decisions were made. we're trying to ensure that our documentation site is the true single source of truth. And so a lot of that looks like creating a system that's flexible enough no matter the discipline. So if you're a designer, there are parts of the documentation that might be more relevant for you. If you're an engineer, there might be something else. And one of the biggest challenges has definitely been how do we prioritize information within a page? How do we ensure that it's applicable to both designers and engineers and that they're able to get the information they want quickly enough, right? With enough information that that can answer the question and it doesn't have to evolve into a Slack conversation or office hours if it doesn't need to, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like that's something that I've learned a couple of years ago, where you want to provide enough documentation, but you don't want to give people a second peek. You want to kind of give them enough that they could see, scan, and really understand, or kind of look for what they were looking for. Um,
Yeah.
so my question is like, what do you consider to be great characteristics of design system documentation?
I think one of our biggest learnings over the past year, especially based on survey feedback from both designers and engineers, has been to have realistic examples throughout our documentation. So I know this is something we did, like this has always been an issue on design systems I've worked on, but when you're initially creating a component and designing a component, it's very common to think of the happy path, right? So the ideal drop down, the ideal side nav. And then when we go to write the documentation and we create the examples for the documentation, we started off on Gestalt using like item one, item two, item three with link, item four with really, really, really long text. Like, you're trying to cover the corner cases, but it's still not a realistic example. So, one of the biggest things we've tried to improve, especially these last couple of months and going forward, looking to next year's planning, is ensuring that our examples are actually taken from the product. And we try to replicate product examples as deeply as possible so that when folks are looking at Pinterest and they look at the platform switcher or their account switcher and they're trying to understand, okay, what component is behind that, or how would I implement something similar, they can go to the Gestalt docs and see examples that mirror those real life use cases. And I think that's definitely been some like a bit of a learning experience for all of us, but especially for me going forward and thinking about like for mobile example, how do we document examples on mobile? And right now we don't necessarily have a way to show live code for mobile components. So again, how do we take realistic screenshots or how do we create realistic designs in Figma that we can use for the documentation that will be helpful going forward? And then I think the other the other really important characteristic for great design systems documentation is that it's equally usable by newbies and power users. So, like, if you're new to the system, you're new to the company, you're new to your role, whatever it might be, the design system should have support for that phase of your life. And if you've been at the company for 5 years and you're very familiar with the design system and you know the component names in and out, it should also support that experience. So, for example, we have like a visual component overview page that was requested very often in our surveys for people who are like, I need something that I click something and something drops down. I don't know what that's called. At my last company, it was called menu. Right here in Gestalt, we call it drop down, right? Like naming is always the hardest part of design systems. And so building in something into our documentation that made it easier to find items and learn about the system without knowing the names was really important to us. But then on the other side, if you're a power user and you've been using Gestalt for a really long time and you've maybe even contributed to Gestalt too, for example, we have an option to collapse and show all of our prop tables. And so as a power user, if you open those up, it'll remember that setting through cookies and it'll always be open for you. So if you need the props table and that's your key thing, you can go straight there. We're trying to have a really powerful search so that if you just have, you need a combo box and you need it with tags, you can just type it into the search box, be directed directly to that example. So covering both sides as well as we can has definitely been really important to us too.
Yeah, I love that you brought up realistic examples because I've definitely seen the whole like long long text here
Yeah,
wrapping and
exactly.
people are going, "Well, this is weird. Why would I need this?" And then 2 weeks later, "Hey, what do I do when I have a long text?" So I
Exactly.
was curious, you mentioned pulling in real examples from product, and I was wondering like what that looks like. Like how does your team keep track of product features and product examples?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it is quite literally using the product as much as we can. So, sometimes I'll use a new feature within Pinterest and I'll realize, oh, I haven't actually been down this path before. And I'll take some screenshots and add it to like my notes or one of our kind of documentation folders as examples that we could potentially upgrade in our docs. I think a lot of it is also working really closely with the feature designers in their crits, having them come to office hours, being very tapped into the new work that they're planning to do or any updates that they're planning to make to features. And again, recording those as potential examples we can use for our documentation. So I think it's a very proactive thing. It's definitely the easier route of doing item one with really long text, right? Having realistic examples is a lot more work, but we found that it's definitely worth it. It cuts back a lot on our support questions and the time we spend answering those questions in Slack or in office hours. Because if the question can be answered with that initial realistic example in the docs, then follow-up isn't even needed.
Yeah, I love your emphasis on office hours and the crits. Obviously, it seems like they are very valuable to both featured teams as well as the design system team. You mentioned like making documentation understandable for both new users as well as seasoned veterans using the design system, and so I was wondering like what kind of systems or processes does your team have in place so that you can ensure that the documentation is understandable and also up to date?
Yeah. One thing that we introduced, I think at the beginning of 2022, was a specific Gestalt onboarding session for all new designers. And it's required for designers, it's optional for content designers and new product managers, but 9 times out of 10, they always want to join as well. So we haven't had trouble with attendance in that sense, but we've seen a big improvement in terms of people understanding when they immediately join Pinterest that there is a design system, right? That's something you want people to know out of the gate. You don't want it to be a surprise later on when they're asked, like, oh, why didn't you follow the design system? And they give you a blank stare, like, oh, we have one. So we want to avoid that. It's been really helpful for initial education. It's been very helpful for people just getting to know the team, right? Having a face to put behind the folks that work on the design system and getting them familiar with what our documentation site looks like, how to ask questions, how to sign up for office hours. So I think that's been one key improvement in terms of ensuring that for anyone joining Pinterest, particularly within the design org, they're very comfortable with asking us questions and reaching out to us. And they get an initial sense of what the design system is there to do and how it's there to support their job. And then I think in terms of ensuring that our design system stays up to date and making sure the quality stays at the bar that we want. One thing we've actually done recently on the code side was switch from kind of writing inline markdown code for our documentation to using something called Standpack, which actually lets us write our examples as if they were being produced realistically in React and rendered as they would, which doesn't sound like a very big difference, but what we found was that everything that we were writing within the markdown was not getting checked by any linters or any like format checker. So as we've been working to convert our examples, we've found a lot of mistakes in all of our example code. So it was never anything totally obvious, but things like missing props that were technically required or props in the wrong format, And so switching over to something that could take advantage of the tooling for us instead of being a manual process has really been an advantage. The other thing that I've really appreciated, especially lately, is we actually taught our designers on the team how to use GitHub and how to make PRs and pull requests and how to, improve documentation or fix any spelling mistakes or update the examples or the screenshots used in our docs. And so having the designers make their own pull requests and make the changes that they want to see when we only have really 3 engineers who are working on the code has really been helpful for all of us in kind of maintaining the quality of the system and keeping it up to date because otherwise things can very easily end up in a backlog in Jira of, I want this the screenshot switched out, but we have 5 components we also need to build and that inevitably ends up being kind of forgotten. So it's been a really valuable change for the team and one that I think the designers are also really proud of and enjoying.
Yeah, that's great. I feel like having designers be able to empower themselves to be able to kind of make those changes is super useful because I definitely was in the past where any documentation change had to go through me, and that was probably like the worst experience ever because it'd
Yes.
be like, I want this like little dot there, and I would like have to open the PR, and it's just like, so
Yeah.
it was a whole issue. But I think that's probably a good way to kind of empower people to kind of make those changes. I have a follow-up question about like the docs overall. So wondering, is there for the designers, like, do they keep like documentation within Figma, or is it kind of assumed that like any documentation that's revolves around the components or the design system should live inside the doc site?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have our library in Figma set up so that it's an exact mirror of our documentation site. Um, and there's limited documentation in Figma regarding that component. And we take advantage a lot of linking out to our actual doc site within Figma. We also have kind of an exploratory Figma plugin that lets folks view the documentation right there, basically in an iframe within Figma, so they can read the documentation without leaving the context of Figma. We've tried really hard to avoid duplication because, again, that makes it a lot harder to maintain design systems documentation if you have everything written twice and you make a change and you realize, okay, I've updated everything on our site, and now I have to go through Figma and update everything there too. So we try to limit the overlap as much as possible while still giving folks kind of the speediest way to understand the documentation and get access to it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about not duplicating documentation, and always kind of saying that the source of truth should be the doc site if there's any documentation not. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Cool. So want to wrap this up, but I'm wondering, let's say someone is interested in being in design system or wants to be a design technologist. What is one piece of advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think if people are trying to figure out if design systems or design technology is the right path for them, I think anyone who feels like they don't necessarily belong in design and they don't necessarily belong in engineering, I think that's a great first signal, right? That, there is this kind of in between that I think a lot of us find ourselves falling into. And I know I've heard feedback from folks that sometimes it feels like a disadvantage to feel like you're not totally a designer and not totally an engineer. But I think that's a huge advantage. I think that's a positive place to be, is being able to understand the language of both sides. So I think if people are feeling that kind of pull between the two and feel like they don't necessarily know which way to go, I would encourage them to consider maybe design technology or UX engineering might be the place for them. I think in design systems in general, I started off in internships working very much in the back end side of things and quickly realized that while I love coding, I wanted to be earlier on in the product life cycle. So I wanted to be working with product managers and designers and researchers when they were making decisions rather than being the person who implements those decisions. And so I think similarly, if folks want something a little bit more creative, a little bit more visual, and earlier on in the product life cycle, again, I think design systems might be the place for you because I think it's such a impactful area to be in to know that you are kind of the first users of new features, of new components. You have a chance to get feedback and work with customers and users directly to ensure that the things that will be built are effective, are accessible, and are enjoyable. So I think that's, if anyone's considering kind of whether or not design systems might be for them, I think if any of that sounded interesting and exciting to you, then I think that's a good sign that design systems might be your happy place.
Yeah, I love that. I actually recently came to a quote. You know, you've heard of the quote like "Jack of all trades, master of none."
Yeah.
But that's only one half of the quote. So the whole quote
Oh,
is "Jack of all trades, master of none, though oftentimes better than master of one."
ooh, yeah, I like that. I feel like that's design systems in a nutshell.
Oh, I'm actually might get that tattooed somewhere on my body because I feel that that's something I need to remind myself oftentimes. But um, cool. So I'm wondering if people want to find you or support you, how could they find you?
Yeah, I think these days I would probably recommend LinkedIn. I think I'm pivoting a little to focus more on LinkedIn messages. So I'm on there as Aisha Mazrana with my maiden name, Mazumdar, in parentheses. So that's how you'll know you found me. I should hopefully be the only Aisha Mazrana on LinkedIn now. But yeah, folks are always happy to reach out there. And then I love chatting with people about design technology and design systems and animation and prototyping and accessibility and all the fun things that come into the realm of this job. So folks are encouraged to reach out anytime.
Well, thank you so much, Aisha, for joining us. And this is a special episode. This is our last episode of 2022. So I'm so glad you're able to join us. It's been a
Yes.
journey. We launched this podcast this year, so it's been really fun.
That's so exciting. I'm so happy for both of you. I think this is something that's needed. I know design and technology is not necessarily the most talked about area so far, so I'm very thankful for both of you and this podcast.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, everyone have a great rest of the year, and I guess happy holidays and happy new year.
See ya. 2023.
Woo!